Good day, folks. Welcome to today's podcast, In Defense of Trotskyism. Now, this is a podcast that years ago I could never have imagined myself making, partly because I just didn't take Trotskyism seriously. And I'll readily admit part of the reason for that was I'd never read any of Trotsky's texts, nor had I read a comprehensive biography of Lev Trotsky. Now, as many of us know, Lev Trotsky was a key figure in the 1917 Russian Revolution and also had been a leading figure in the 1905 Russian Revolution and held important parts in the early part of the Soviet government, particularly Minister of Defense. So Trotsky is often presented as the idealistic alternative for communism, which is partly why I didn't take Trotsky's ideas seriously. I used to believe that it was a form of wishful thinking, one of those historical what-ifs. What if Trotsky had succeeded Lenin in the power struggle that Stalin had ultimately won? Would the Soviet Union have taken a very different course? Well, it's not for this podcast to answer that question because historical what-ifs just aren't really very productive. But ideas are what matter, and it's Trotsky's implacable enemy Stalin who gave us an important quote. Ideas are more powerful than guns. We would not let our enemies have guns, so why should we let them have ideas? So Trotskyism was an idea that was pilloried for much of the 1920s and 1930s. Indeed, the late Mikhail Gorbachev, shortly after he was born, his father was arrested on the charge of inciting Trotsky's subversion. Indeed, Trotskyism was that all-haunting spectre and scapegoat blamed for everything that went wrong in the Soviet Union. Everything from failing to meet quotas in coal production to any crop failures would be blamed on Trotskyism. Indeed, it's very possible that the figure of Emmanuel Goldstein in George Orwell's 1984 was in some ways an allusion to Trotsky himself, as Trotsky was this ever-present enemy and hate figure within Stalin's Soviet Union. But let's not talk about the historical analogies or historical realities. Let's get down to the ideas. So why am I making this podcast as an attempt to just say, let's take Trotskyism a little bit more seriously? Well, first of all is the idea of the permanent revolution. Now, the idea of permanent revolution, I've been told by certain Marxists, some actually in government positions, that this is a problem with Trotskyism, the idea of permanent revolution. So what actually is the idea of permanent revolution? Well, it's the idea of a revolution that does not compromise with any form of class rule. A revolution that constantly sets itself against bureaucratization and the system becoming ossified. So this is found in Trotsky's short work on the permanent revolution, and also in his longer work, The Revolution Betrayed. So if we look at the realities of Soviet history, particularly if we get to the late 1960s and the 1970s through the early 80s, we come to what's known as the Brezhnev stagnation, where you had a ruling elite that just muddled through, basically. And not only were they muddling through, economic growth had hit a plateau. There was very little in the way of innovation in anything else other than the military. And this is often cited as examples that communism or socialism just doesn't work. But again, many things, practice and ideas. So we need to separate practice and ideas. So why am I making a case that perhaps with an element of Trotskyism, this could have been different. Well, the idea of permanent revolution, and in turn world revolution, which we'll talk about a bit later, is not unique to Trotsky. Um, Lenin in the State and Revolution spoke about the right of recall for any cadres or representatives of the people. And we certainly didn't see this practiced for most of the Soviet Union. Or indeed, we don't really see that practiced very well in the Western world. Um, the idea of right of recall is that if somebody in public office is not doing a particularly good job, you have the right to recall and hold them to election again. So yeah, this doesn't sound like a bad idea. Neither does term limits. So the idea of permanent revolution is to prevent an ossified and static bureaucratic form of government. We look around the world and we see ossified and bureaucratic governance all over. I mean, I don't really think it's a conspiracy theory to say that ultimately things are run by civil servants. And then again, would you even trust many elected representatives to run things better than civil servants? That's a whole other debate. But the important idea of permanent revolution is that it's a revolution that doesn't stop. It doesn't say, right, well, okay, workers hold power, we have equal representation of classes, right, let's just stop there and get on and govern. No, the permanent revolution is always vigilant. It's always vigilant against any kind of compromise with class rule and any kind of bureaucratization and any form of corruption. So if we look at one of the things that led to the downfall of the Soviet Union, it was not just bureaucratization, but corruption. Indeed, many of the attempts to shake the system up were focused on anti-corruption. The late Yuri Andropov, during his less than 2 year tenure as General Secretary of the Communist Party, did introduce a program of reform, kind of a perestroika light version, and this involved the right of workers to inform upon company managers and state enterprise managers, and like basically a whistleblowing campaign, because corruption and vested interests had become endemic. Many people were just milking the cow but not feeding the cow. So the idea that this is often cited as more proof that communism doesn't work. You'll hear people like Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro citing this, and yeah, but it's not as though this is unique to socialist countries. I mean, capitalism can be quite wasteful. Who would disagree on that? There's hundreds of examples I could give you. I mean, one example is that Shell Oil was once actually burning off oil reserves because it was cheaper to burn them than to sell them on the market, following the market price at a loss. So the idea that socialism is wasteful, well, is it really any more wasteful than capitalism? Amazon selling stuff at below cost, Amazon throwing things away. I won't go on any further. So apart from the theory that permanent revolution makes no compromise with class rule, makes no compromise with ossified or bureaucratic governance and simply muddling through, it's inextricably linked to Trotsky's idea of world revolution. And world revolution was not exclusive to Trotsky. So world revolution is often presented as the counter-argument of Stalinism's policy of socialism in one country. So the idea of why world revolution was considered necessary by Trotsky and also by Lenin. I mean, Lenin did establish Comintern, which was designed to spread socialist revolution throughout Europe and the rest of the world. Why world revolution was seen as a necessity by Trotsky and others was that if you have a socialist revolution in Russia, that revolution will be strangled or at least held back by other powers. Um, well, this did happen. You obviously see the Russian Civil War, which was supported, where the White Russian armies disaffected Mensheviks or former Tsarist officials, fought against the newly established Soviet government. And this was supported by other powers, including the US and the UK. And so that's one factor. The other factor is that Russia, or rather the Soviet Union, became isolated from the early 1920s up until World War II. And again, it was isolated because of Bolshevism. People wouldn't trade with the Soviet Union. It was shut out of world financial markets. But it obviously, as we know, it did survive. It seemed to almost thrive on the isolation. So this may be tying myself in a knot. This may be seen as a counter argument to world revolution or permanent revolution. But however, it could be argued that that without the isolation, the way the Soviet Union went could have been quite different. You may not have had the excesses or the famines. This may not have happened if there was other friendly socialist states around that would have traded with the Soviet Union. So that's one argument. Now, the other argument for world revolution is that, it's kind of the universalist principle that if it's good for you, well, it should be good for other people. And injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So that's in one side it's idealistic. On the other side, it's practical because as practice shows that socialist states, or at least those following a more stringent socialist line, can and do become isolated. Some can do okay in that isolation, such as the Soviet Union under Stalin. Some don't do so okay, such as North Korea today. So the idea of world revolution is that basically that revolution can't exist as an island. Well, it has done, but only to a limited degree. Now at the same time, the necessity of permanent revolution, again, I think history speaks for itself. We did see that the Soviet Union became heavily bureaucratized under Stalin and became ossified and just stagnant under Brezhnev. So therefore, you could say that if permanent revolution had been applied, history could have been very different. What that would have been, I don't know, and it's not for this podcast to speculate. It's just to say, maybe look at this idea more seriously. So a bit about Trotsky and Trotskyism. Well, as many maybe know, Lev Trotsky was born in 1879 in what's now Ukraine, then part of the Russian Empire. He had been imprisoned and exiled in Siberia, which is where he got the name Trotsky. He was originally born Lev Bronstein, but he adopted the name Trotsky while he was in prison and escaped rather heroically on a sledge, on a dog-pulled sledge, and then became an agitator and was instrumental in the failed 1905 revolution. Now, a charge often used against him is that he was a Menshevik and then changed at the last minute to the Bolsheviks. Well, yeah, that's true. But so did many others. And equal charges could be made against Stalin himself. I mean, about people being supposedly lukewarm in their commitment. Well, I mean, who hasn't changed positions in their life or careers? Tell me, because I don't really think there really is anyone. So, um, what about Trotsky's influence? Well, obviously, a legacy of Trotsky is the Russian Revolution itself. Um, Lenin acknowledged Trotsky's role in the Russian Revolution, and in Lenin's testament, he described Trotsky as capable. This didn't mean an endorsement for Trotsky becoming the uh, paramount leader of the Soviet Union. Lenin, in his testament, called for a more collective leadership. Well, collective leadership sounds good, but it never seems to last. There's always some particular dominant figure who eventually subverts the collective leadership and makes himself top dog. And well, obviously, in the case of the Soviet Union, as we know, that was Stalin. So while ideas may sound great in theory, in practice they often don't work out. But Trotskyism has rarely ever been put into practice, if ever. Indeed, I don't know an actual Trotskyist party that's ever taken power. Now, there are Trotskyist parties out there. The Socialist Workers' Party in UK, to name one, and many can be found throughout different countries. They haven't held power, but like we could say, Trotskyism, we don't know how it works in practice because it's never really been applied. In China, I do know that one of the two co-founders of the Chinese Communist Party, Chen Duxiu, was also the first General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, later left the party and led China's short-lived Trotskyist movement. Now, this isn't a podcast on China, but it's worth saying that Trotskyism, as far as I know in China, has not had much influence apart from, like I said, the short-lived Trotskyist movement. Where I've mentioned Trotsky to Chinese friends or colleagues, often it's got a muted response and they don't know who he is. So he's more well known among Western intellectuals or Western people of left-wing standings. Within Russia now, I'm not really sure. I do know that Trotsky was one of the very few old Bolsheviks who was never posthumously rehabilitated under Perestroika. When I've asked Russians about Lev Trotsky, it's never garnered much of a response. But Trotsky's impact on history is without argument. He was obviously a key figure in establishing the Soviet government and a key figure in establishing the Red Army and victory in the Russian Civil War. Just obviously, we know that he was forced out of the government by Stalin, forced into exile first in Almaty, then various other countries such as Turkey, France, and eventually Mexico, where he was eventually assassinated by an NKVD agent with a climbing axe, not an ice pick as commonly believed. He had a very, very interesting life. His friendship with Frida Kahlo can be seen in the 2002 movie Frida, starring the rather attractive Salma Hayek, with the rather capable Geoffrey Rush playing Lev Trotsky. And his place in history is there. I would just say look at Trotskyism with a more open mind. There's some good ideas there, and as I said, the main point of this podcast is ideas. As Eleanor Roosevelt once said, small minds discuss people, average minds discuss events, great minds discuss ideas. Thank you all.